Hello everyone! So today, continuing on with our watercolor crayon experience, I am going to check out the Staedtler watercolor crayons. Now there are 12 of these. These are from their Design Journey series. So first things first, let's unbox these bad boys. So here's the packaging. They actually kind of show you like the progression you would take with watercolor crayons if you're using them for art, not adult coloring. But these are, so the reason I buy watercolor crayons is I buy them for ease. I want to be able to color in like a background or a base color and then activate them and then, go from there. That's why I buy watercolor crayons. If I want something, or if I need to put it on a palette and take it from palette to paper, at that point, I already got watercolors. So when I'm looking at watercolor crayons, keep that in mind. So if I'm talking about how they're not dissolving well, or I don't like how they, dissolve on the paper, it's because I'm buying them for convenience. If I wanted a watercolor, I've got tons of watercolor palettes. So just FYI there. All right, so let's pop this bad boy open. Now I've had these actually sitting here for quite a while. So they do have this little styrofoam thing that never actually stays on the crayons. I'm not gonna lie, these look incredibly cheaply made at first glance, but maybe they'll surprise us. So we have, it'll say Staedtler and then a number, which I find is interesting because they're not available open stock, at least that I could find. So if you are able to find them open stock, let me know. I could not. Now the name for us who speak US English is Cobalt Blue right there. It does have the little dash or dotted lines and then these little loops letting you know that you could peel it from here and rip to expose more crayon, because as with all watercolor crayons, the entire thing is usable. So when you sharpen this, or if you need to sharpen it, don't ever put it in your regular pencil sharpener. Have a special sharpener off to the side so that you can save the shavings, because you can activate those with water. So none of this should go to waste except the paper. So yeah, that's the crayons. Now they come in this little case, but it's just a one-sided box. So you still need to put them back in here or a separate case. Now one thing I am going to do that I didn't do on my last test with the Faber-Castells. So I normally do dry and then one that I activate on the paper, but I'm also going to put them on my palette and do the palette on here as well. I'm going to skip white for a second and just kind of show you what I mean. Okay, so this is the Crayon Dash palette. You don't have to use this one. My kids accidentally put it in the bottom shelf of the dishwasher and now it's got little dings on it. You can actually get like those cheap cutting boards and they usually have a rough side. That's all you need. But basically what I'll be doing is I'll be doing a dry swatch. Wow, those are, not gonna lie, they're a little scratchy. Then I'm gonna make a spot that'll be activated. Okay. And then I'm also going to put some right here on the palette. Wow, these are really dry and scratchy. Ugh. I'll put a spot here on the palette that I'll activate with my brush and put next to it, just so you guys can kind of see how they look and decide for yourself, would you use it as a watercolor? Would you be able to put it on paper? And then I'm going to test it on two types of paper. Now this is cardstock already here. This is not one of the testing papers, but I am using my Nina 110-pound cardstock. I'll try to remember to link it in the description below. I will also test it on my Etcher cold press 100% cotton watercolor paper. This is a Faber-Castell test that we did that didn't turn out well, but I will be testing on that. And then I will be testing it in my Fabriano watercolor paper. Now this is not 100% cotton, however it is cold press, 140 pound, 300 GSM. It's just a little bit, let me find an empty page. It's a little rougher than your typical, because it's not cotton, but I want to test that because some people don't have the budget for 100% cotton or don't want to use it. And this Fabriano is a good alternative, and it's pretty similar to other cold press papers that aren't cotton. So we'll be testing on both of those. All right, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to be swatching these all out and then activating them. But for the sake of your sanity, I will put on some relaxing music, and you guys can watch me swatch and activate. Then we'll do the watercolor paper tests after, without any music. And then we'll also discuss kind of the results, what I think, comparing these to other watercolor crayons and water-soluble crayons that I have in my collection. And yeah, go from there. So let's get swatching. Okay, so as I kind of anticipated, especially with how scratchy these were going down, so these are really a hard watercolor crayon, not very soft. They did dissolve quite well on the paper. As you can still see the lines pretty much on every single color. Yellow, I know it's hard to see, but it's still there. White's about the only one that dissolved, but that's kind of cheating. None of them really dissolved. Now, activating them on the palette and putting them onto the paper, beautiful color. And you didn't really lose much in terms of pigment, because I mean, if you compare, let's, for example, Bordeaux, see the color here after the crayon was activated? Pretty much the same from the palette. Same with the cobalt blue, the light blue. So it didn't get much lighter, and I was using a paintbrush this time, because I have gotten some snarky comments about using a water brush, although that is what most of us use in adult coloring. So, but it's fine. I have a lot of watercolor brushes. So I used a number 8 round Princeton Aqua Elite. So these hold quite a bit of water, not as much as my whatchamacallits. Hello, silver black velvets, but didn't feel like breaking that out. But yeah, overall, with the water it held, looked pretty good. Now I know when swatching, like, black looked really rich, but remember, watercolor always dries lighter, so it turns into a nice little gray color. Of course, I could, you know, grab some more from my palette. I still got some hanging out over here. These will keep reactivating too on your palette. You know, darken it up, do whatever I want. Could reactivate this green here, and then put it back on the page. It's going to be lighter, of course, because I got less pigment, but this on the palette, this is not trash. Like, you could literally keep using this, and you should if you had a more expensive crayon. With ones that are this cheap, you know, it's not like I go, oh, every ounce counts, but some of us are on a budget, so always remember that if you put them on a palette, this is still watercolor that you can use, whether you've activated it already or not, because these are watercolors in crayon form. I know, it can get confusing. All right, so they didn't dissolve well on cardstock like this, which is often what we find in our adult coloring books. But let's give them a chance on watercolor paper. So this is that Fabriano, again, not cotton, but it is cold pressed. I just want to I want to activate them and then blend them. Oh man, these things are so scratchy. I am not like exaggerating. Oh, gives me the chills. Let's see. The red color was kind of crappy on the cardstock. I want to see if it looks better on this. All right, get my brush and let's see how they do here. Now, because this isn't cotton, it's not going to be as thirsty, and it's got those thicker grooves, so it is dissolving a little better than the cardstock, which I usually expect on this paper. The whole time I was doing the sped up music version, there were no jets, and then they've come back. Now the blues aren't even dissolving. The lines are still there. Now let's pull out my Etcher cold press. I can already tell you, I'm pretty positive they're not going to dissolve on here because this is thirsty paper. So most likely this is where you would be like, okay, I'm going to put these on a palette, bring them over here. But let's try it anyway. So we'll just put some colors. I like to blend them together. Now I'm not pressing hard. It might sound that way, but that's just because these are so hard and scratchy. I'm actually doing light layer because if you do press hard, you're going to leave a line. I'm just doing light, as light as I can with how hard these things are. It's almost like they're dried out. But let's see. This is my cotton paper, so we need a little bit more water for this thirsty medium. The color looks a lot better on 100% cotton, but most watercolors do look better on cotton. That's just one gal's opinion, but we'll let it dry. You can still see the lines though already. And now the lines, when it's wet, you may not see them as much, but once it dries, that's when you really see them. But I can already see back and forth now. If I go, now this is just called overworking at this point. I mean, you're not doing yourself any favors, but I'm just curious if I keep going at it, how much effort it'll take to finally dissolve. Yeah, I can still see those lines. They're not breaking loose anytime soon. That said, say I take that blue on my palette that's still over here. I don't have a ton left, but this is the light blue. Oh, that soaks into that paper beautifully. Oh, look at that. But again, that's off the palette, and it's lighter right now because I don't have a ton down. So let's go over to this one real fast now that it's dried up. Okay, as you can see, the lines are there, clear as day. And this is kind of like if you buy adult coloring books that are printed on watercolor paper, most are printed on this type, not cotton, but a pretty ridgy cold press paper. Don't get me wrong, I like the paper. But you're gonna get a different effect on this versus 100% cotton. But yeah, you can see the lines, and interestingly enough, the Faber-Castell dissolved better on the other one. All right, as you can see, this is starting to dry up. Oops, let me just stick my finger right in there. But you can see the lines still there. So if you plan to use these directly on an adult coloring book, on your sketchbook, and you want to, like, sketch something out with your crayon and then dissolve it, you're going to have some lines left. Now, some artwork, it looks really cool to have those lines left. Others, like say if you're doing some filler, I would definitely put it on the palette. Otherwise, your background might look a little funky. So yeah, even from an art perspective, especially with watercolor, because I do have a lot of watercolor art, but I also do adult coloring. From those two perspectives, it's still, do you want the lines there? If you want the lines there, well, these will leave them. But if you want to, be able to draw out your art and blend everything together and not have lines from the crayon, you're not going to get that on any paper with these ones. I mean, I've tested the cardstock, I've tested the 100% cotton, and I've tested even the cheaper cold press. So that just gives you an idea. These definitely shine being put on a palette. So for me, it's not worth it because I have a ton of watercolors, with light fast ratings and pigment information, none of which is available on these. So I don't even know what pigments they've used to create this yellow or salmon. And then a couple notes here. This is a 12 count set. You don't have a purple or a pink really. Although if you water down that red or even the Bordeaux enough, you're going to get it. The salmon is more the orangey. That said, purple can be made, mixing colors. So you would definitely have to mix, but I would mix them on your palette, obviously not on your page. I do like that you have 2 varieties of green. I'm glad they included a brown. I would have almost rather they just gave me a gray and not a black, but that's just a preference. The white for me, the thing is white, when you add white to a watercolor, whether it's a crayon or a half pan of actual color, white, depending on what it's made with, can make something really opaque. And if it's really cheap quality, can make it also very chalky. So when these sets include whites, I actually don't find a need for the white. And that's just more the art side of me talking than the adult coloring side of me. Simply because if I want to water or, lighten up a color, I'm not adding white to it. I'm just going to add more water. So the more water, say, I added to the palette of this yellow, I could get a nice pastel yellow. Same with this blue. I could lighten this up with just water on the palette. The white crayon to me is just kind of a waste of space, but I know why they include it, especially for beginners or those who don't know color mixing or don't want to mix or just want to throw in some white for effects. That said, if you go to say add your white on top here, dry or something, well, it's not really going to show much. So it's not going to do much there. But yeah, I've always had kind of that quirk with the white added into even watercolor pan sets because I don't really need it unless I want to make pastel, actual pastels where I don't mind if they have a little bit of a chalky look to them and the opacity. Watering these down to make pastels make them still transparent. So always keep that in mind. All right, so these are not necessarily inexpensive. I have had these sitting here waiting for this video for honestly 5 months now. So I can't remember what I paid for them at the time, but they're not necessarily cheap. And considering how scratchy they are, I would not recommend these for adult coloring unless you plan to put them on the palette. That said, there are other brands that are affordable but give you a better color output, better range of colors, and better performance. Like the Lyra Aquarelle crayons, I think that's the name of them. I just did a video on them and I can't remember. They're actually pretty budget friendly. You can get a smaller pack. Obviously, if I was comparing these to Neocolor 2, well, these have lost. So there you go. Even the Mungyo oil pastels, I feel would perform better than these. But that said, if you're looking for something like a 12 count set that can be mixed on a palette and used on the go, because these are pretty handy rather than walking around with watercolor tins, you just have to have a palette nearby. So you could definitely take this on the go, or you could make your own little palette by taking these shavings and cutting them down, one at a time, putting them in a little half pan, getting them wet, mixing them together, and you've just created your own, in this case, VanDyke Brown, or Brune, to take on the go in a palette if you want to do it that way. But for adult coloring, unless you plan to use these like watercolors and wet them on the palette first, they're not really going to work the way I use crayons for adult coloring, because again, if I'm already going to put it on a palette, I'm going to just grab my watercolors and go for it. So that's my opinion, of course. As with any review I do, it's always opinion based because we're all different. For some of you, these may be absolutely perfect. I will leave a link in the description below. You can get them on Amazon. They do come from a great brand, Staedtler, so, you know, at least you have the backing of a good brand and it's not one of those random ones that pop up here and now and then. But yeah, overall, not incredibly impressed, and this is like the second watercolor crayon review in a row now that I'm like, so I'm hoping the next set I review I can be like, woohoo, finally. But yeah, let me know if you have these, if you've tried them, what you thought. But overall, they're not bad, but they're not great. I definitely will probably let my kids play with these ones just because I have so many other watercolor crayons. Or, you know what, maybe I'll put these in the Happy Mail. I have a Happy Mail bin I'm creating for my subscribers. So the list or the form to get on my Happy Mail list is always in the description below if you want to jump on that, because once I get too many supplies, I kind of just plan on doing a de-stash. Whether I do it on camera or I just ship them with no notice, depends on my time. But I think these might go in that stash because I don't want to hoard supplies I'm never going to use. So keep that in mind and keep an eye out for that. All right. I've chatted long enough. Thanks for hanging out with me, checking out the Staedtler watercolor crayons. Next video, I plan to do the Sargent Art watercolor crayons, which I have been requested. So keep an eye out for that one. And until next time, take care. Bye now.